So today we're looking at conscience, which is part of the ethics chapter of the OCR A-Level Religious Studies specification, which is chapter 2.8. So firstly, a recap. So conscience is the term people often give to their inner sense of right and wrong. And discussions about the conscience consider what it is, where it comes from, and whether the conscience can be a reliable source of moral knowledge. So have a pause of this video and see whether you can define these key terms before we go into them. So firstly, conscientia. This is the name Aquinas, if you remember Aquinas from Natural Moral Law, gives to the process whereby a person's reason makes moral judgment. And with Aquinas, he tells us how we basically use our conscience in order to understand natural moral law. So do have a look at my natural moral law video if you haven't already. Ratio is the word used by Aquinas to describe reason, which is something which is placed in every person as a result of their being created in the image of God, or imago Dei. Synderesis for Aquinas is that it's to follow the good and to avoid evil, and this is the rule that all precepts from his primary and secondary precepts follow. And he says that all humans do this. All humans want to do good and avoid evil. And there's obviously criticisms of this. The id looks more from Freud's definition. So this is the part of the mind that has instinctive impulses that seek satisfaction in pleasure. Then the second part of the conscience for Freud is the ego. So he uses this word to describe the mediation between the id and the superego. And then the third and final aspect of conscience that Freud says we have is the superego. So Freud uses this word to describe the part of the mind that contradicts the id and uses the internalized ideals from parents and society to make the ego behave morally. So firstly, let's look at these biblical passages that relate to conscience, which can be adapted and used when describing Aquinas' thoughts on conscience. The first quote that you can use is, "For I do not do the good I want to, but the evil I do not want to do." So this is from Romans, and it talks about Paul's struggles with the way his actions conflict with his inner sense of right and wrong. So again, you can kind of look into Paul's own struggles, into understanding what the right and wrong is within him internally, which again, Aquinas would talk about using our reason and rationality in order to figure out what the right and wrong is. The second quote you can use is, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." So again, from Genesis, in the creation of Adam and Eve. So this quote shows that some see the conscience as an aspect of humanity made in the image of God. So it's a God-given concept that we have, created with the ability to discern right from wrong. So we can understand what right wrong is because we are made in the image of God. So always whenever you give these kind of quotes, adapt them and analyze them into what they could mean. They could have different meanings as well, so always illustrate these different things. So Thomas Aquinas had a theological approach to conscience because he was a Catholic priest. So he did not think that conscience was an independent special faculty or power capable of telling people what is right and wrong. He thought that the conscience is an aspect of human reason. And if you remember, Aquinas always talks about reason being really important, rationality, autonomy, because we can understand what the God-given law is, and then we can live it out. So Aquinas thought reason is what separates us from other animals, and he called this reason ratio, because he didn't think that animals could have ratio or reason, which is what separates us. Aquinas believed reason is a gift from God placed in every person because everyone is made in the image and the likeness of God. You can also use the quote from Genesis where God is said to breathe the breath of life into Adam. You could take that or interpret that as breathing into conscience or breathing into the soul to understand what right and wrong is. Aquinas also talked about rational enabling us to work things out and make judgments about them. So Aquinas made use of his understanding of reason in his ethical teaching about natural law. So do take a look at that video if you haven't already, as well as his teaching about the conscience. So we thought that within each person there is a principle called synderesis, which encourages us to do good and avoid evil. But again, the criticism for this is that everyone seeks to do good and avoid evil. Some people want to do evil. For example, psychopaths is a clear example where they know something is wrong, yet they do it anyway. Or sociopaths, where they don't feel the guilt for doing something bad. That's automatically going against the synderesis principle. So it's a good example to use to counter Aquinas' assumption here. So furthermore, he thought that we can cultivate synderesis in ourselves through effort so that it becomes a habit. So if we try to do good, then our reason will help us. And the more good we try to do, the more it will cultivate, as we will make it a habit within our lives. Aquinas also thought that our consciences are binding because it's wrong to go against reason. So he thought that we should do what we think is right, and what we also have a duty to make sure our reason is well informed when we make moral decisions. And he did not argue that conscience should be followed simply as a gut feeling. Aquinas here would be very similar to Kant, saying if we just follow gut feelings, they're not always correct because they are based on emotions, and obviously emotions don't use reason and rationality, which is what Kant and Aquinas want to follow. They want us to use our reason, our rationale, in order to fulfill God's will. So therefore we cannot follow gut feelings, because gut feelings do not always make us do good. So people cannot be blamed if they follow their consciences when they make moral judgments based on the best of their knowledge, but they can sometimes do wrong through ignorance. And he makes a distinction of these two different kinds of ignorance. So one is vincible ignorance and the other one is invincible ignorance. So vincible ignorance is a lack of knowledge which the person could have done something about. So if people do the wrong thing through ignorance when they could have informed themselves better, then they are blameworthy. So, for example, you could use an example of, say, two friends were in a car and they crashed. Thankfully, no one got hurt, but you can blame the person for being drunk driving. They should have known that after 2 drinks, they shouldn't have got in the car. So this is vincible ignorance. They can be blameworthy for their actions that they took, and they should have known better. Whilst vincible ignorance is the opposite. So it's sometimes people act in good faith and allow their conscience, but they get things wrong because of ignorance of facts they could have not known and could have not been expected to know anything about. So they can't be blamed for this. So an example of this might be your parents buying you a car and the brakes might be faulty, so you might end up crashing. Your parents cannot be blamed for that because they didn't know. So in this way, it's saying that although something bad happened, they can't be blamed for it. So that, yeah, these are examples that you can use. It's always good with these vincible and invincible ignorances or anything similar to give us a really similar example of like driving a car or whatever we want to use, just to illustrate how one has a knowledge of knowing and could and being able to maybe do something different about it, versus one where there isn't an option where you could have done something different to prevent it. And Cardinal John Henry Newman, who is a leading Catholic of the 19th century, famously said, "To conscience first and to the Pope afterwards." So this quote basically shows that his belief that conscience should take priority even over the teachings of the Catholic Church. So he's basically saying that everyone has reason and therefore can use their own conscience. So therefore you should not be following what people tell you to do blindly. So for example, if the Catholic Church is so against abortion, you shouldn't be following it, the principle of abortion, just because the Catholic Church says you cannot perform it or have an abortion. You should be able to use your reason and rationality in order to see whether it is the right thing to do for you. That's basically the kind of outline of what he's trying to say here. You can apply this to different examples. So he's basically saying that responsibility of moral actions falls on the individual and not the institution itself. You have a mind, you have rationality, you have conscience in order to determine what is right and wrong, not just blindly following institutions or what people tell you to do. So what are possible criticisms of Aquinas' ideas about conscience? Firstly, it can be argued that Aquinas does not take into account the extent to which our moral reasoning is influenced by our upbringing and our society. So what seems to be conscience could be the values of our society that we have learned and that we've taken on, rather than what we have figured out. So for example, if you're born into a Catholic family, you're more likely to have Catholic values. So therefore, you might be more against certain things and more pro certain things. However, it doesn't mean you have to, right? As Cardinal said earlier that we looked at, you can still make your own decisions. So some disagree that conscience is the human mind making moral decisions and think that instead it comes more directly from God. So for example, Augustine, Joseph Butler and Cardinal Newman were more inclined to think in this way. So this is basically saying more that it comes more directly as a gift from God, that it's God speaking through you, which is basically saying that Aquinas isn't going far enough and giving too much autonomy to humans. Most people might not agree with this, but these are the key thinkers that would disagree with Aquinas' thoughts here. And talking with this, you could also even include people like John Calvin, who was a Calvinist and obviously believed in predestination. So in that way, you are predestined and pre-programmed in order to think in certain ways and maybe do certain actions, because some people are predestined to go to heaven and some people aren't. So it's another kind of criticism you can make of Aquinas for giving too much rationality and autonomy and free will to humans, because he doesn't believe that people would have this and it's something that God has predetermined. So now we're looking at the other side of the conscience topic in your OCR specification, and this is Freud's psychological approach to the conscience. So who was Freud? He was one of the founders of psychoanalysis and wrote his major works in the first half of the 20th century. So Freud believed that the conscience is not a rational decision making, but comes from an inner unconscious part of our mind that has been shaped by our upbringing. So Freud kind of revolutionizes that our childhood and our upbringing really determine our moral decisions and our behaviors and our egos and our mind as we become adults. So he thought that our minds have several layers, like layers of a rock would have, or an onion. So we know what we are thinking about on the surface, but there are kinds of deep ideas, memories and habits that we are not always fully aware of, but that still influence the ways in which we think and behave. So these are done unconsciously. So we might have things in our conscience and at the forefront of our thinking, but then we have things deeper that affect the decisions that we make and we don't even realize or know it. So Freud thought that the way the mind works is closely linked to sexuality, and he thought there are 5 stages of psychosexual development. And these are probably the most aspects where you can criticize Freud, is his over-sexualization of conscience, for example. But in order to criticize them, we need to go through them first. So the first stage of psychosexual development for Freud was the oral stage, which happens between the ages of when you're born and to a 1-year-old. So this is where a child derives pleasure from oral activities such as sucking and tasting, and successfully fulfillment of the child's feeding needs and proper weaning will result in the establishment of trust. For example, being hungry and receiving food, whether through sucking through the mother's breast or through a milk bottle. So too much or too little gratification can bring about an oral fixation when the child grows up and can result in addictions, such as drinking too much alcohol, smoking, overeating, and nail biting. So these sensations and vices, most people would say, come out of this first oral stage. The second is the anal stage. This is between the ages of 2 and 3. And the main sources of gratification for a child during this psychosexual stage is the ability to control the bladder and bowel movement. So a positive and appropriate experience revolving around potty training encourages a sense of competence, creativity, and productivity. So on the contrary, anal fixations can translate into obsessions with perfection, extreme cleanliness, and control of the opposite, which is messiness and disorganization in adulthood. So again, you can kind of see how he's analysing the anal stage relating to behaviours within adults later on in life. The third stage is the phallic stage, which happens between the ages of 3 and 6. So during this psychosexual stage, the erogenous zone is the genitals. So boys start to perceive their father as rivals for their mother's affections, whilst girls feel similarity towards their mother. So Freud used the term the Oedipus complex. So basically saying that boys have an attachment to their mothers and want to sleep with their mothers, and therefore they end up having hatred and resentment towards their fathers. And therefore Freud also said that a lot of people then end up having to search for a perfect father figure that they don't have, which then creates the idea of a god that is perfect and the ideal father that they don't have. And Carl Jung later used the Electra complex to describe girls' attachments towards their father in a similar context to the Oedipus complex, but the other way around. And the fear of punishment leads to repression of feelings towards the opposite sex parent, and fixation on this stage may bring about sexual deviancy or weak sexual identity, or also the belief in religion and a god. The fourth stage is the latency stage. So this is from 6 years old to puberty. And during this psychosexual development stage, sexual urges are usually repressed. So children spend most of their time interacting with same-sex peers, engaging in hobbies and acquiring skills. And adults who are fixated at this time are immature and have a hard time forming meaningful relationships because of the repression of all these feelings. And the final stage is the genital stage, which is from puberty onwards. So during the last psychosexual stage, the erogenous zone is the genitals again. So individuals' sexual urges are reawakened and are directed towards the opposite sex peers, in Freud's view. But it's unlike the phallic stage. So the sexuality at the genital stage is consensual, and people who completed the early stages successfully become well-adjusted, caring, and secure individuals at this stage. But the younger children are mostly ruled by their id, which we'll go into later, and focus on their wants. Individuals at this stage have fully formed the ego and the superego. And this is what creates that balance, which we'll look into, which is the wants, which is the id, the reality, which is the ego, and the ethics, which is the superego. So now to look at the different stages and aspects of the human personality that Freud identified, which is the id, the ego, and the superego. So the ego is the thing that manages and guides the id. So it's the ego that learns from parents and forms society about behaviour that is considered appropriate in different social settings. The ego manages the id's feelings of frustration when immediate gratification isn't possible, and when the ego acts in some ways as the conscience, because it remembers which actions are appropriate and which are inappropriate. So, for example, the ego would tell us not to pick our noses in public, not to swear at individuals, or not to do inappropriate things that we see and know not to do in public situations. The id then, as we said, is a powerful part of our personalities within us from birth. So it leads us to seek pleasure and it wants immediate gratification. And the superego is where the mind stores moral teachings and social rules received during upbringing. So religious and moral feelings, as well as conscience, are in Freud's view related to the superego as well. And the way you can kind of outline this is, for example, a child, if it wants something, it will scream, "I want a biscuit," and it will get a biscuit. That's what it learns. But as it grows older, it realizes that it doesn't go from "I want, so I scream" to "I get a biscuit." It's more, I want a biscuit, I think about it, I then realise that I have to ask politely to receive a biscuit, and then I will probably most likely get one. So you can kind of see how the id is the want of me wanting a biscuit. The ego is me realising I need to ask for it politely, and the superego is that moral teaching of me being able to get it through being polite, and through that conditioning of me learning that I'm going to get it only if I ask politely, because otherwise my parents won't give it to me, for example. It's the kind of example you can use to really illustrate the relationships between these three things. Another way to look at the id, the ego, and the superego as a conscience is through this kind of image. So within here we can see an iceberg, and you can think about this as your conscience. So the ego is what is perceived and what is seen by everyone else. The id is kind of not unseen, so it's your wants, it's your desires, and it's only one part of the aspects. The other thing is the superego, which then you can see is far greater, and it's something that we can understand and helps us guide through developing conditional aspects through society. And this is obviously all unconscious, so it lies beneath the surface of the sea, whilst the conscience is what we're aware of, which is the ego. So this is a really good way you can also use to illustrate, if the biscuit example isn't what helps you, is the iceberg example, what's on the surface, what is conscience, and what is underneath, and is within the unconscious. So you might not even be aware of these things, but they still shape who you are and what you do and how you behave, for Freud. So Freud then talked about these three aspects of the mind as not totally separate, but interrelated in dynamic ways. And for him, the conscience arises from the interplay between the id, the ego, and the superego. So while feelings about different actions arise because of the ways our minds have developed. And Erich Fromm, as you can see here on the right, then developed this theory. So he developed Freud's ideas, and he wrote of the immature and the mature conscience. So this is based on an unthinking response of feelings of guilt, whereas the mature conscience involves rational thinking and decision making. So again, you kind of see feelings of guilt are me unthinking but me feeling, whilst the mature conscience is me rationalizing and making decisions based on my wants and desires, and my social conditioning. So what are some criticisms of Freud's accounts of conscience? Firstly, he does not consider the possibility of there being any relation between the conscience and God. He completely erases the possibility of it. And I mean, for some people this is a really good thing, because for atheists they would agree with this more. So he dismisses the idea of God without a discussion. It is more of a problem, he doesn't even consider it. Many thinkers believe that Freud puts too much emphasis on human sexuality and underpinning every aspect of psychology through human sexuality, through the 5 stages of psychosexual development, and especially the Oedipus complex as well. So rather than looking at the wider range of possibilities and influences of the human mind itself. And a lot of people also say that maybe it actually tells us more about Freud's own sexual fascinations and addictions rather than about humanity. However, his distinction between the id, the ego, and the superego is a very, very good explanation of how the mind functions. And he was very revolutionary in kind of saying and showing that our childhood does affect how we are as adults. That is something undeniable that has been very influential within psychology and counselling, even through psychotherapy, for example, healing the inner child. It's a really good influence of how it has actually helped people overcome the traumas and things that have happened to them and patterns that they have noticed within themselves because of what's happened to them in their childhood. So although there are a lot of criticisms of Freud in this sexual fascination and obsession, his overall argument of the conscience and the id, the ego, and superego are very influential within psychology. So you might get a question asking on a comparison of Aquinas and Freud's views on conscience. So we're going to go through these now. Both Aquinas and Freud understand conscience as an individual making moral decisions. So these are similarities first. They both think the conscience can sometimes be in opposition to whatever the majority popular view is held by society. So, for example, homosexuality being illegal in the 50s, for example, but people being gay and not believing that it's wrong, right? Obviously, that's changed through time and now is legal, and gay marriage is also legalised in the UK anyway. But that's kind of the view that you can use as an example. They both think that conscience can be shaped or educated. They both see the conscience as something other than the direct voice of God. So obviously Aquinas through reason and rationality, Freud through the id, the ego, and the superego. They both agree that guilt can be destructive for humanity, and both see a link between guilt and human desires for sensual pleasure. Obviously different ways. Through Aquinas it's his Vincible and Invincible argument, and Freud it's the psychosexual developments. And there are parallels between Aquinas' understanding of the affected operation of reason in the cultivation of synderesis, in a personhood character, that's meant to say, and Freud's understanding of the mentality of healthy state of a balance between the ego and the superego. So both saw the importance of that balance between those. So here you've got it more in a table outline. So Aquinas sees conscience as activity of God-given reason, whilst Freud thinks that it doesn't include the idea of God at all in his account of conscience. Aquinas sees wrongdoing in terms of sin and right and wrong in terms of the will of God, whilst Freud does not have an idea about right and wrong as absolute values. So again, as absolute we mean there is a direct right and wrong, and sees it more as in terms of the norms of society and what then you believe or how you take them on. Aquinas understands guilt in terms of feeling of being to blame and moral wrongdoing or praiseworthiness, whilst Freud sees guilt in terms of internal conflict between the different aspects of the personality and them not agreeing and not being in a balance. Aquinas understands the conscience as the workings of human reason when making moral decisions, whilst Freud understands the conscience to work on a more subconscious level. Aquinas sees the conscience as morally binding, and in Freud's view, the conscience does not relate to any kind of absolute right or wrong, but reflects the operation between the id, the superego, and the ego. And finally, Aquinas was writing in the 13th century when people understood many puzzling aspects of the world in terms of theology. So he was revolutionary for his time by including reason, whilst Freud was writing in the early 20th century where there had been significant advances in medicine. So he's post-Enlightenment, and some development of the social sciences as well, so the early stages of psychology. So that's all of the AA1 content. So do take a pause of the video and see whether you can answer all these questions, and if you can, you know all the AA1 content that you need to know. And now it's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. So first we're going to look at this question: is Aquinas' understanding of the conscience is convincing? Discuss. So first, for AO1 knowledge, you need to demonstrate knowledge and understand through the use of some of the following ideas. So describe and explain Aquinas' understanding of the conscience by including reference of his understanding of ratio, synderesis, and conscientia. You also need to describe and explain examples of the views of the key thinkers and sources of wisdom and authority that support or criticise Aquinas on conscience. So this might be teachings of the Catholic Church, for example. And again, you want to explain, criticise and respond to these within that. And also you want a description, explanation of alternatives, understandings, so criticisms of conscience, such as Freud. You might agree that Freud is better, or you might say Freud is worse, but do make a decision on that, but you do need to include him. So with agreeing with the statement, you might want to put the following ideas. So the view that conscience is the working of the reason might appeal to those who do not find the voice of God approach convincing. So the working of reason would explain why people can conscientiously arrive at different moral conclusions. You might also want to say that Aquinas' view that the conscience can be improved with education might be convincing, and also give examples of this. So how can it be improved with education? For Aquinas, probably would be through Bible study and understanding the interpretations of Scripture, and how to use the principles of natural moral law and knowing the precepts. Aquinas' view might be considered more convincing than those of people who think conscience is nothing more than socialization, as Aquinas' conviction that there are absolute rights and wrongs is appealing to many who find relativism does not provide an adequate reason for trying to be good. And then you might want to look at some statements that disagree with the statements. So you might say that Aquinas assumes the existence of God, which is not an assumption everyone accepts. Aquinas' belief that there are absolute rights and wrongs is something that requires justification, and relativists would disagree with him. His view of human nature as seeking the good could be seen as overly optimistic. So again, here is a psychopath example. Not everyone seeks to do good, but some people seek to do bad and follow pleasure. And other views you might want to talk about of the conscience might be seen to be more convincing. So for example, Freud. So you might want to talk about the id, the ego and superego, the 5 stages of psychosexual development, and rather than it being a God-given duty. So everything that we covered. And then we had this kind of question that could also come up. So to what extent should the conscience be regarded as a reliable guide to moral decision making? This one's a bit more broader, so you can include different aspects as well. So here again, you need to describe and explain different views of the conscience, referring to Aquinas, Newman, Freud and Fromm. So you've got the 2 theological ones, Aquinas and Newman, and the 2 psychological ones, which is Freud and Fromm. But you don't have to be limited to these, you can include others as well. Describing and explaining of the extent to which conscience is considered important in making moral decisions. So you might actually want to refer to different ethical theories that are part of the syllabus. So Kant's deontology, Bentham's utilitarianism, and Mill's utilitarianism, raw utilitarianism, and Fletcher's situation ethics. So these are things you might want to draw and pull. And if you do mention them, you do have to explain briefly with clarity what they are and examples of how they might say we have conscience. So for Kant, it's rationality again, so similar to Aquinas, which might actually be a nice link. Bentham and Mill would be pleasure, and Fletcher, obviously, agape love. So agreeing with the statement, it could be argued that the conscience is a channel through which to hear the voice of God, in which case it should be regarded as more authoritative than the human set of rules or principles. Aquinas' view that the conscience should be obeyed because it is the working of reason might be supported. It could be argued that conscience is a reliable guide to decision making only when it's properly informed, and that the caution should be taken to avoid making or mistaking current public opinion for conscience. All of these points are points, I just want to make that clear. You would have to develop these with examples and explanations and support and analysis throughout this, but these are good points to make. To disagree, you might want to make the following argument. So again, really good points to make. Is Freud's right and conscience is no more than socialization, so it's only as reliable as the opinions of parents, peer groups and wider society. So again, you would need to give examples and develop these of how Freud is saying that these are just socialization and how they influence the conscience. You could argue it's very difficult for people to make a distinction between what their consciences are saying and what society is telling to do. So there's that conflict there, that we could have an internal conflict between the 3 aspects of the conscience for Freud, the id, the ego and superego. You could also argue that the differences of opinion reached by conscientious individuals might suggest that conscience is not reliable, as different consciences reach vastly different conclusions. And you could also say that there's no such thing as a reliable aspect of conscience, because there's no absolute moral standards to get right or wrong. So in that aspect, you would not be agreeing with any particular ethical theory. It might be something like utilitarianism, because it doesn't say that there is an absolute. It would be a non-consequentialist theory that you could support here. So that's the end. Do make sure that you always include loads of examples that are clear and follow through the structure and support the points that you're making, and are very, that your essay always flows in a very nice way, that it's all interconnected and you're building upon your arguments and you're not randomly adding things in. It all has to relate to each other. So your criticism should relate to the points that you're making, and then you should respond directly to the criticisms. So always link back to the question as well throughout. So yeah, this is all that we have on the conscience. So I'll see me next time for more religious studies, philosophy and ethics.